Welcome to this portion of Confessing Like a Lutheran, Culture of Controversy. As you've become familiar with in our previous episodes, words matter. What we're going to explore in the remainder of these episodes is how the language the confessors used leading up to the time of Luther's death, as well as after his death, became a point of contention that eventually fractured the movement Luther initiated.
Right. Simply put, what started as a confession of faith, as found in the Augsburg Confession, turned into a matter of legal necessity when those who subscribed to it put pen to paper. And when legal necessity rears its head, precision in language becomes all the more important. What history reveals is that following Luther's death, more than ever, the dispute over language became the focus of the next generation of Lutherans. Kind of right up my alley.
It sure is. But the fact that language matters was not simply a matter of a dispute centered in theological nuances. The issues were more complex than that. The political and social context also need to be considered, as they provide insight in the controversies and their subsequent resolutions. Therefore, in this episode, we're going to talk about the reality on the ground politically in Luther's time and in the years shortly after he died.
You may remember that Martin Luther died of natural causes on February 18, 1546, 25 years after Emperor Charles V had declared him an outlaw. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about Charles in the Reformation class, but he did put his power behind the Roman Church's effort to kill Luther and his followers as heretics. And although his power may have been somewhat limited, Charles' impact on the Reformation was not insignificant, both before and after Luther died.
Right. Charles ruled more land and people than any European ruler, and he had tremendous financial resources at his disposal. He grew up in the Netherlands, the homeland of Erasmus, by the way, and Charles's education was saturated with the ideals of humanism and moralism.
And while he doesn't appear to have had a clear understanding of what Luther was addressing, he did know that if the Pope's authority could be challenged by Luther, so too could be the emperor's authority. Therefore, Charles took interest in what was happening in Luther's homeland of Saxony. And, as history shows, when the opportunity presented itself, Charles threw his weight behind the Pope in an effort to eradicate Luther and the Lutherans.
This is why knowing the political landscape is really informative. The politics of the Holy Roman Empire were such that the emperor was not simply a power unto himself. The emperor was elected by the princes of the empire, and the legal governance of the empire was complex.
All of this is to say that in reality, Charles' power over the German estates was limited to some degree. Moreover, his responsibilities and resources were widespread, extending well into Spain and Italy.
Additionally, he fought the royal family in France for decades, all of which limited his capacity to deal with Luther directly in Germany. And to add to his burden, he was dealing with an ongoing Muslim threat in Vienna and along the Mediterranean Sea that kept his focus far away from the German territories.
That brings us to 1546, 25 years after the Diet of Worms. Finally, Emperor Charles had the resources and the capacity to deal with the Lutheran issue. Rather than wage war broadly against Lutherans, though, Charles decided to single out the two leading princes in the Protestant League of Smalcald, Elector John Frederick of Saxony, who was Luther's prince-elector, and Landgrave Philip of Hesse.
Even this was not a simple military calculation. Charles chose those two leaders because he could exploit their legal vulnerabilities. Philip was guilty of bigamy, a crime specifically forbidden as of 1532, and John Frederick was charged with using illegal force against the clerics at Wurzen and Naumburg to extend the Reformation influence beyond his territory. And they had both gone to war against Duke Heinrich, who had burned the evangelical city of Einbeck in an effort to get it back into the Roman Catholic fold.
Charles also knew how to leverage relationships and people's self-serving interests. So, Duke Moritz, who was Frederick's cousin and Philip's son-in-law, became Charles' pawn in his maneuvering with the Germans.
Now, The point of all this is not simply to repeat the narrative of history for its own sake. What we want you to notice is something we'll come across frequently as we talk about the controversies that played out after Luther's death.
Simply put, the Lutheran confessions did not arise out of abstract theological or even political disputes. These were deeply personal matters as well, and very personal relationships were fractured and betrayed.
Right. And Duke Moritz is an interesting character in all of this. While he claimed to be a Lutheran, he betrayed the evangelical cause and weighed in with Emperor Charles to fight and ultimately defeat John Frederick and Philip. Charles rewarded Duke Moritz for his help by giving him John Frederick's title and position as Elector of Saxony and much of his territory.
Charles imprisoned John Frederick for 7 years and Philip for 5 years. And at first, it seemed everything was going Charles' way. He defeated the evangelical or Lutheran reform. But anyone who takes history seriously knows that day-to-day events are not one-dimensional. While Charles was lining up his alliance with Moritz, the alliance between the Pope and Charles fell apart in early 1547. Additionally, Emperor Charles was dealing with infighting with his brother regarding a succession plan.
As part of this complicated political maze, Charles took the initiative to reimpose Catholic theology on the Protestants in the empire. So, in 1548, he implemented his own reform plan in an attempt to suppress the Lutheran confession. That document, now called the Augsburg Interim, reinstated all Roman Catholic practices and beliefs with 2 exceptions. Priests could marry, and communion with both kinds, bread and wine, could be given.
Moritz, who was now in control of the University of Wittenberg and a large portion of the Protestant lands, did not enforce this decree. Rather, he decided to go back to the negotiation table in hopes of softening the effects of the Augsburg Interim by coming up with a compromise agreement. So he enlisted the aid of Wittenberg's theologians, including Melanchthon.
At first, Melanchthon refused to have anything to do with writing a compromise document, but eventually, he and other theologians worked on a document that came to be known as the Leipzig Interim.
The Leipzig Interim allowed for compromise with Roman Catholic positions on matters deemed to be non-essential or neutral practices. The technical term used to describe these practices is adiaphora.
We'll talk more in the next episode about the concept of adiaphora and how the Leipzig Interim helped to create a significant controversy. But for now, we simply want to make you aware of the role politics and personalities played in creating a controversy that arose out of forcing the confessors to compromise on their original confession.
An interesting wrinkle in all of this is that the Augsburg Interim, with all the noise and disruption it caused, was never actually implemented. And the same thing happened for the Leipzig Interim. It was presented to the princes and city representatives of Saxony in December 1548, but it was never accepted.
Much of the opposition to the Leipzig Interim was in reaction to the willingness to compromise with the Romanists on non-essentials, even in the face of persecution. In fact, many of Melanchthon's students felt very betrayed and disappointed by his willingness to concede. They knew he stood strong in the face of accusations of heresy and the threat of death in Augsburg in 1530, when he wrote and presented the Augsburg Confession. And so, his apparent softening and willingness to compromise did not sit well with Melanchthon's many students. Simply put, while these documents were never implemented, their ramifications permanently shaped the course of Lutheranism.
As we said earlier, one needs to be aware of who you're in alliance with. If you align with someone who has betrayed his previous partners, don't be so naive as to think it won't circle back around. And that's precisely how it played out with Duke Moritz.
Right. After realizing that the Emperor Charles intended to strip the imperial princes and cities of all meaningful authority, he changed sides, again, and rejoined the evangelicals to lead the princes' revolt of the early 1550s. That war was ultimately resolved in the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, where evangelicals were finally given legal standing in the empire. This peace, by the way, lasted until the 30 Years' War in 1618.
And while there may have been political peace, theological battles raged throughout the 1550s and 60s. Melanchthon was in the middle of many of these battles until his death in 1560, as were a number of other theologians you'll come to know in the remainder of our discussions.
For now, we want you to know that after Melanchthon's death, so in the late 1560s and 70s, theologians at the University of Wittenberg, who believed they were propagating Melanchthon's ideas, began to become increasingly more vocal, and the theological fights became increasingly more intense.
As a result of these disagreements, starting with the Adiaphora controversy in 1548 and encompassing a number of other controversies through the 1570s, the second generation of Lutherans began to explore ways for Lutherans to come to agreement.
Now, we come to one of the most salient points in our conversation about the Lutheran confessions, specifically what came after Luther died. Lutherans were arguing with one another for decades following the Augsburg and Leipzig interims. Those arguments were fracturing the evangelical cause, and people knew that if the fractures and disputes remained, the strength of the evangelical alliance would be compromised.
So the second generation of Lutherans recognized they needed to come to some sort of agreement through negotiations and carefully crafted language that would resolve the issues.
Here's where it's helpful to have a lawyer's experience in teaching this, because lawyers know the dynamics of a negotiation and compromise.
Right, and this is an important thing to recognize. Negotiations, any sort of negotiation, be it in business, law, or theology, will always be resolved in a compromise. And a compromise means neither side gets exactly what they want. So if you're going to negotiate a theological point, then you've actually compromised the principle, which means it's no longer a confession coming out of your conscience informed by the gospel, but it's now a calculation in the law.
Keep this in mind from this point forward in these episodes, because you're going to come to realize that there are things in the formula of Concord and in the epitome that don't line up with what you've been reading to this point.
That is a natural result of negotiations, and specifically, those negotiations started in the 1570s.
Ultimately, after a series of documents and theological statements had been drafted and presented for discussion by a professor at Tübingen University, Jakob André, and by a church leader from central Germany, Martin Chemnitz, among others, a document was drafted that served as a starting point for resolving the theological battles. That document is known as the Swabian Concord of 1573.
I can't imagine the level of negotiations and compromise that had to be made. We get a clue from the fact that the document was revised, debated, and revised even more.
Yes, and more opinions entered the fray. Different groups of theologians presented their own documents for review and discussion, and finally in 1577, in the town of Bergen, the final document was reviewed and agreed upon, and ultimately signed by 51 princes, a number of city representatives, and over 8,000 representative people. A lawyer's dream, right?
A lawyer's nightmare, unless I could bill them the current hourly rate.
That document from Bergen is now known as the Formula of Concord. It's the last part of what we have as the Book of Concord.
And my word nerd brain wants you to pay attention to the title. Concord means peace or agreement, and that's precisely what both the formula and the Book of Concord are intended to convey: peace and agreement, the final resolution of a number of deep controversies and divides between the Lutherans in that time.
But as we proceed through the remainder of these episodes, wrapping up what it means to be a confessional Lutheran, you will see that even the simple word concord reveals how and why there are fractures and disputes to this day amongst those who call themselves Lutheran.
I bet they're waiting for you to make some sort of snarky comment about me now.
Maybe we have come to some sort of concord.